Welcome to Talk Plus Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive in the world of water with those making waves. This is Todd Bottler, and I'm your host for Talk Plus Water. I'm also principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, in which I conduct water research, provide facilitation and mediation services and training, and provide recruiting services for water executives. You can find out more about Collaborative Water Resolution at waterdisputes.org. My guests today are all veterans of Talk Plus Water. Vanessa Puig-Williams, the Senior Director of Climate Resilient Water Systems at the Environmental Defense Fund. Jeremy Mazur, the Director of Infrastructure and Natural Resources Policy for Texas 2036. And Carlos Rubinstein, the Principal of RSAH2O LLC. Vanessa, Jeremy, and Carlos, welcome back to Talk Plus Water.
Thank you. Great to be back, Todd.
Thank you.
All right, so everybody's going to be wondering, where on earth are they? So we're in the domain at Taberna. Is that how you pronounce it, you think? Taberna? A restaurant named Taberna. And if you've listened to this podcast in the past, our discussions about legislative sessions are usually done at a bar, and so they're kind of noisy like this. And, the reason I do that is the people who are having to spend, all their time down at the legislature, for how many months is it? It's almost 6 months.
It feels never ending.
Yeah. They need a break.
Of late, it's
right.
never ending.
Right.
And we're here in the middle of the day, but I didn't order a drink. Maybe
Well, you can. You can. And so I'm just, iced tea is it for me today, but, you are welcome to have a libation and relax a little bit as much as you can while we talk about the legislative session, which is now in the books, or so we thought. So we'll talk about the 89th Texas Legislature regular session, and then we'll discuss the special session after that. But before we, get to our first question, obviously we've gone through the 89th session. It's a historic water session by any measure. And so, Jeremy, we're going to let you kick it off. My question for you is, when did it become apparent that we were entering into an historic water session? I mean, long before the session started, or when you got into it, or when did you say, okay, it's really going to happen this time?
We saw the fundamentals organizing for this to be a historic, generational water infrastructure session, I think in the months leading up to January. There were several things. There were a couple reports that were produced by Texas 2036 that pointed towards the need for sustained water infrastructure investment and why that was essential for the continuation of Texas' economic miracle. There was a huge coalition that was launched that included trade organizations, chambers of commerce, and business groups that grew over time, that was calling for sustained investment in water infrastructure as a way to continue Texas' economic miracle. And so when the 89th legislature gavelled in early January 2025, a lot of groundwork had been already undertaken in order to lay the foundations for this being a historic generational session for Texas water infrastructure future. And I think this groundwork was certainly cemented when Governor Abbott in early February made investment in water infrastructure an emergency item and a top priority for this legislature's agenda.
So just a follow-up on that, that's unusual, right? I mean, I don't remember seeing a governor doing that in a long time, and so that was a big indicator that something special was going to happen.
Yeah, and when I did the homework, the last time I think a governor made water infrastructure funding an emergency item of this magnitude was like at least 40 years ago.
Right.
So even though we've had severe droughts, we've had severe floods in the intervening decades, this was the first time where we had a clear, bright, signal coming from the state's governor to tell the legislature to make water infrastructure funding the priority that it ultimately was.
Gotcha. You want to add to
Yeah,
that,
well, I was going
Vanessa?
to actually ask Jeremy a question, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Put him on the spot.
I mean, but wouldn't you also say that, like, could you say that this all began back in the 88th session when we saw, passage of the measure that allocated $1 billion to water and the development of the Texas Water Fund? It's like we kind of all have been hoping that this would be the session that it came to be. Like, I'm just curious if you...
I think politically there was a lot of groundwork done in 2024 to set the stage for 2025 being as successful as it was. But I think you're also right, Vanessa, when we look at the 2023 session, where the legislature approved the creation of the Texas Water Fund and the $1 billion appropriation to that fund, and the recognition that this $1 billion was literally a drop in the bucket when measured against the magnitude of the need. But the other glimmer of hope that happened in the 2023 session was there was a joint resolution that passed that proposed amending the Constitution to create dedicated funding for the Texas Water Fund. And it passed the House, didn't make it past the Senate's deadlines.
Right.
But that also gave us some insight that, hey, there's clearly some political appetite within the legislature for doing more.
Yeah, it laid the groundwork. Yeah.
I agree with the point that this has been coming for a while. But coming for a while doesn't mean it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really the story of the 89. I agree that the seeds we started to see them sprouting a little bit during the 88. We have seen some of that before.
Yeah.
It hasn't led to this critical step that we just saw during the 89 session. I also think that it was more than telegraphed and high expectations were set during the interim. Yeah. As in, we're not going to let the ball drop this time. And I'm thankful for the leadership down at the Capitol that saw it through. If you would have asked, I think if you would have, honestly, you would have asked any of us, are we going to end up in January? Are we going to end up at the end of May with a bill that dedicates $22.5 billion because of the supplemental over the next 20 years? I would have said, yeah, what are you smoking? It ain't going to happen. And it did. And I think that that's remarkable.
What's it like to go from being, the mercurial water group to the popular kids down at the legislature? I mean, it's like everybody was talking about, it happened like y'all say, but, it was just a main part of the discussion the entire time. Like, I was watching that and it's like, wow, I wonder what that's like.
I think my take is that the leadership, look, we're water geeks or water nerds.
I didn't want to say that, but
okay,
yes.
But we are. But when we start to talk to non-water nerds about water, we can lose them very quickly. I think my take, and I welcome different opinions, is that the leadership finally started to recognize that the Texas miracle, the future of economic development in Texas, everything we do, water is the most limiting factor. And I think that that's what drove it. That's my opinion.
Well, I mean, it was certainly refreshing to, see the level of engagement from all the offices and staff on water. I mean, just coming to briefings, just reaching out with questions all the time, wanting to learn. I felt like that was different than in other sessions, for sure.
And they're educated for the next session now.
I think Carlos is right. I think once the issue of water infrastructure became entwined as being an economic development issue, and once lawmakers recognized that if we want this thing called the Texas economic miracle to continue with population and economic growth, you need to have reliable water infrastructure for that to happen. Because there's been some brutal lessons taught over the past few years about what the economic consequences of insufficient water infrastructure are. but also what we saw during Winter Storm Uri, where the electric grid went out, incurring hundreds of billions of dollars in economic losses. Not to mention the largest boil water notice believed to have happened in U.S. history and water outages. It really showed what insufficient infrastructure, energy infrastructure and water infrastructure means to not only community stability, but also continued prosperity and growth.
I agree with that. I totally agree.
And communities are feeling it now in a myriad of different ways.
All right, we're getting a pizza delivery.
Mine. Thank you.
Let the record show that Vanessa has a kale salad.
Vanessa always worries about healthy food.
I do.
Thank you. Okay, so Vanessa, don't take your first bite
I won't.
yet, because you're first up on this next question. While there were a number of water bills that made it across the finish line, the focus, of course, was funding, and the major bills for that were Senate Bill 7 and the companion House Joint Resolution 7. So tell us, if you would, what SB 7 and HJR 7 do. What are they going to do?
Sure, and I'm definitely going to let Jeremy weigh in on here because he was more involved in the development of both of those bills than I was. But HJR 7 is really the funding mechanism for, the Texas Water Fund for this ballot measure that we're going to be voting on in November. And then Senate Bill 7 is the implementing legislation. I kind of thought of Senate Bill 7 as building a bit on the substance of what we all worked on in Senate Bill 28 from the previous session. And so, that created the Texas Water Fund. It created the new water supply fund that's nested within the Texas Water Fund. But then in this legislative session with Senate Bill 7, we saw the addition of more programs to the Texas Water Fund, like the Flood Infrastructure Fund, which I know we'll be talking more about flooding in a little bit, and I think was a really, hindsight's 2020. I think it's a really good thing that fund is now part of the Texas Water Fund because it will open the doors for the board to get more funding out. We added wastewater reuse to the new water supply fund, which was something that many groups had worked on trying to make happen last session. So it's good to see that this time around. The Ag Water Conservation Program now is also part of the Texas Water Fund. So I think there's an opportunity for the Water Development Board to really make that program even more meaningful than it has been. Because from my perspective, groundwater, which is primarily what is used for irrigation across the state, it's our biggest source of water. We've really only been putting $1 million or so a year into ag efficiency. So I'm hoping that now that this is part of the Texas Water Fund, that the board will be able to think a lot bigger about what that program can be. But, really it's all about under Senate Bill 7, like the programs and funding the water supply, funding water infrastructure, and all the programs that fall under that. And then, of course, with the joint resolution, it really laid out how those programs are funded. And there was a lot of back and forth during session about how much goes to new water supply, how much goes to infrastructure. Ultimately, the legislature split that 50-50. So I don't know, Jeremy or Carlos, if y'all want to add to that. But.
Just a little footnote before they do, for our listeners who are not aware of this, ag water use is the largest single use in Texas, about half of water we use annually. Okay.
So the linchpin of the whole package is House Joint Resolution 7 by Chairman Cody Harris. And this proposes to amend the Texas Constitution to dedicate $1 billion in sales tax revenues over the next 20 years towards the Texas Water Fund. And it's largely modeled after what we already do for state highway funding, where the legislature and voters have already approved the dedication of sales tax revenues to the Texas Highway Fund. And this has really worked to build out Texas' transportation portfolio. And so HJR 7, if voters approve it in November, will basically make sure that up to $20 billion in sales taxes can go to the water fund in the next 20 years. Now, there's some caveats here. First, it's the first $1 billion after the first $46 billion in sales tax collections for any given fiscal year. So, and for comparison, this is about the amount of sales tax collections that the state collected in 2023. So if we have a long-term recession, or if we have stagnant economic growth, such as we saw during the COVID pandemic, there's a chance it may not be able to be funded. There's also a provision in HJR 7 that says that, well, if there's a declared emergency or declared disaster in the Texas Disaster Act, then the legislature can vote to divert a portion of this dedicated funding towards emergency response purposes. And so when I say up to $20 billion may be allocated over the coming decades towards the water infrastructure fund, there's a couple caveats that we need to be mindful of. Like, one, a severe recession or depression could certainly impede that, and we have to face the fact that future disasters could get in the way of that funding. But I think as Vanessa did a great job of saying, SB 7 goes hand in hand with HJR 7. And what the legislature did here was smartly expand the number of water infrastructure programs that would be eligible to receive this funding, including flood control and mitigation through the FIP, as well as water supply programs, as well as programs to start fixing our aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems. Carlos, what do you think about that?
No, I totally agree with you, and I'm glad that you pointed those out. I do want to point out a couple of other nuggets that, for those of us that have been involved in water, and particularly for the communities that fall through the cracks, that were also importantly included in Senate Bill 7 and House Resolution 7. One of them is something that Vanessa and I know Jeremy is as well, are always concerned about: area of origin impacts. Funding projects that are going to move water from where it is to where it isn't and bring a socioeconomic benefit to the receiving area, but in many cases, creating a new unmet need in the area of origin. And they included a provision in there that if we're going to be conveying water from a well in the state, the funds can't go towards that. Well, I think that helps alleviate the bullseye that we inadvertently placed on groundwater when we did regional planning back in 1997, and we had to include then the junior provision of surface water. I think we're balancing that out some way now. Let's not create another emergency while we're trying to solve one. The other one, Jeremy, you and I talked about it, and I do want to say something else about Texas 2036 as well, is, I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley, where a lot of colonias are at, and one of the programs that the Water Development Board has is the Economically Distressed Areas Program. And a couple of sessions ago, it was curtailed, and the amount of the grant was also curtailed from a 90-10 to a 70-30 maximum. Well, that got reversed. That is huge.
Oh, in this legislation?
Well, yeah, and they added it to the Texas Water Fund.
That's correct. And so you look for those nuggets there as well, and they really did some deep thinking. The point I want to make about Texas 2036, it goes back to your first question. Jeremy led an effort now almost 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, where he convened a whole bunch of folks that wanted to talk about what the conditions were in the state of Texas. In 2036, from that input, put together a water blueprint. And Jeremy and I were talking towards the end of the session. If you go back to that water blueprint and you take everything that happened in the 88 and everything that's happened in the 89, because we're going to be talking about bills other than the 7s, huge wins for water. And I want to commend Texas 2036 for having had that effort.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Very, very much appreciated. There's Carlos mentioned something about groundwater exports and how that was a lightning rod during the debate. There were two big debates during the debate over the 7s. And first, and we saw this earlier this month over the massive hearing that we had on groundwater. There was a lot of concern that this funding mechanism could be used to extract surface water and groundwater from one region for the benefit of the other. And that was a huge debate during this session. The second debate, as Vanessa talked about, was whether or not to focus on water infrastructure, fixing your aging, deteriorating systems, or water supply. And I think that debate was ultimately resolved in terms of the 50-50 split. But it was interesting watching this whole legislative debate because I think those were true. There was really consensus about funding. They wanted to do something on funding. But underlying, that debate over funding was what does it mean for exports of water, and also what does it mean for what types of water projects will we be paying for?
Yeah.
And ironically, and I know Vanessa definitely wants to talk about groundwater issues as well and sustainability, look where the session ended. I mean, we have so many bills we can talk about, but towards the end of the session, an issue that all of us have been preaching is likely to come to us is a recognition that we're not sustainably managing groundwater. Well, a big dispute over East Texas is ongoing right now that is taking center point during the special session about should we continue to allow large-scale groundwater transfers when we don't know enough about those impacts.
Right.
And so I think we're in for a very good interim water session as well.
So, some Western states have IBT rules for groundwater transfer.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have that. We have surface water, but I mean, some states say, okay, it doesn't matter whether it's surface water or groundwater. You're going to have to go through this process and try to address these various impacts. And so, let me just say that Jeremy, he started your question, and so,
way to go, Jeremy.
And so let's hear some more from you, Carlos, about these internal debates that were going on about the goals and structure of Senate Bill 7 and HGR 7. Did I say that right? I think it is. And so, I mean, because there was a real debate about how's the money going to be allocated in kind of the two major categories. You want to start off with that?
Well, I think Jeremy covered it really well. I think, it's how do you want to solve the problem and what is it that you're not recognizing? We all recognize that we're running out of water. We all recognize that the existing sources of supply are diminishing. It's in the state water fund. It's been in there for every iteration that I am aware of. And so we cannot continue down this path. We need to value water and treat water differently. So you cannot put all the money in developing new source supply because you need to understand that you need to diversify that portfolio. What wasn't being talked about a lot, but it was towards the end is, so what if we do develop new source supply, but we have leaky pipes?
Right.
Are we valuing water? No, we're not valuing water. We need to recognize that our infrastructure is 70, 80 years old, and when we allow the precious resource to leak out, we're not only doing a disservice to that resource, but also to our users because it adds to the cost of providing service. And I think ultimately, I'm glad that they ended up with a 50-50 split.
Well, let me ask you about that because I think that's a better place to end up from where they started. But the whole allocating it among these two different uses. I mean, the same. That's the thing that I wonder about. I mean, how that's going to age. I mean, because we all know that things go in phases and cycles with water, and so
I want to offer a little bit of clarification. So, at least 50% has to go to water supply, and part of the big debate here was a lot of legislators thought, one, we're a drought-prone state, we're a growing state, we need to have more water molecules to meet these growing demands. And they also said that all of your problems with aging, deteriorating, leaking drinking water and wastewater systems are really moot if you don't have water supplies to begin with. And so that's why we have this at least 50% set aside for water infrastructure. The remaining pot can go to water infrastructure generally, so it's your aging, deteriorating stuff. I think it's really important to point out, especially today after the July 4th floods, that as Vanessa said, it can also be used for flood control and mitigation infrastructure. And so I think it's important to recognize that, it could be used for water supplies and fixing deteriorating systems, but there's also a unique opportunity here to address our long-term flood challenges.
And Jeremy, you're a history buff when it comes to water legislature, and you know better than than many people I know that words in legislation matter. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the initial discussion is at least 50 or 80% at one time for new water sources. What ended up in the bill is for 50%, or at least 50%, for water supply.
Yeah.
There's a difference between new water sources and water supply.
Well, is that because they added, SWIFT was added to the other 50%?
Acronyms.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, the State Water Implementation Fund of Texas, which is the program that funds the projects that are in our state water plan. And so it's 50% that goes to 50% of the money can be used for the new water supply fund and SWIFT, and then 50% can be used for infrastructure, the flood infrastructure plan, the ag water conservation plan, EDAP, like all those programs that are listed under the Texas Water Fund. Sorry, EDAP is the Economically Distressed Areas Program. I can't remember if you said that acronym earlier when you were
No worries.
when you said it, the whole thing, but so I feel like that, Carlos, to your point about it becoming broader than new water supply, that it that yes, it's now funding water supply, but there's still the new water supply fund.
Yes.
And so, if you have a project that maybe isn't in the SWIFT fund, or in the state water plan,
No.
that,
You can use the acronym the first time. We've explained it.
yeah, but if you have a project that's in the state, that's not in the state water plan, but would be eligible as a new water supply project, then you could access this funding.
Okay.
Well, and then one thing I would clarify here is that when we talk about new water supplies, the legislature views new water supplies as new water supply projects that work to expand the inventory of water molecules in Texas.
Yeah.
And so it's your seawater desal, your brackish groundwater desal, purchasing water from elsewhere. That's generally the concept that they're looking at from when it comes to new water supply.
So this is not a question for today, but at some point, I think we're going to we need to have a discussion about whether our regional water planning process should be linked in some ways with the flood planning process we have in the state now, which is a regional process. Because I'm always thinking, they're not really separate in all cases, right? I mean, you're getting your water supply in some cases from flood flows, right? From Corps of Engineers reservoirs that have flood storage and massive recharge events for the Edwards Arbor or something like that. But that's not for today. That is for a future episode of Talk with Water. So today, let's stick with SB 7 and HJR 7. And Jeremy, okay, tell us, what do you think the prospects are for the approval of the water funding by the voters of Texas in November? November 4th, right?
That's right. That's when the election is on Proposition 4. It's nice to hear someone driving by, jamming out in their pickup truck this afternoon. Yeah. I think we know based on the data that water is always a concern of Texas voters. They're worried about their water supplies, and they're worried about the condition of their drinking water and wastewater systems. We saw Proposition 6 that created the Texas Water Fund pass with 77% of the vote. In fact, what's interesting is that more Texans voted for Proposition 6, creating the Texas Water Fund, than any Texans voting for any other water proposition, including the proposition creating the SWIFT in 2013. So we knew from 2 years ago, voter support was already rather robust for water infrastructure. I think our data says we could probably expect a similar outcome this November, but there needs to be a lot of voter education here, because the way that Proposition 4 is worded on the ballot, it's not readily clear to your lay reader that it's about dedicated funding for water infrastructure. And people may be thinking we just had a flood event. Why do we need to talk about paying for water infrastructure? And so I think there needs to be a lot of outreach and education with voters. I'm talking about why we still need to talk about water supply funding, why we need to talk about aging, deteriorating infrastructure, and also now's the time to also talk about needed investments in flood mitigation infrastructure as well.
So, in some of those previous elections you referred to, there was a more or less an organized effort to get the word out among the water community. Any idea that might happen this time?
We just had a meeting today.
Oh,
with
really?
a bunch of groups. Yeah. I mean, I think that all the different organizations that have been working on these issues are interested in ensuring that this ballot measure passes, and we kind of recognize that working together and coordinating is the most efficient way to do that, but that we each have our own maybe like more nuanced messaging and audience that we can target. So we're, I think, kind of all in early stage discussions, but are certainly planning on doing education and, vote yes campaigns to make sure that this thing actually passes, because that's kind of terrifying to think what would happen if it didn't.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it is. I really haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about that, but
Yeah.
boy.
Well, for comparison, remember 2011 was our worst one-year drought, right? Everyone remembers 2011.
Yeah.
Technically, I think the word was it sucked. It was so bad.
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
Yes.
But there was a proposition on the ballot to provide the Water Development Board with evergreen bonding authority for water projects in 2011. It barely passed during the worst one-year drought of record, with just over 50% of the vote. And so I think when we're seeing voters' appetite for water infrastructure investments improve over time, I think what happened in 2011 with that November election, it really shows that we can't take anything for granted, that there needs to be substantive voter education. And it's wonderful, like what Vanessa said, all these different groups are reaching out to their different constituencies to do the voter education that needs to happen.
Well, and I think, and it's sad, and it's a good time to reflect. While the session started about the lack of water and the need to have a diverse and resilient water supply for future Texans, look what just happened earlier this month with the devastating flood. And that speaks to the value of the opposite side of water infrastructure as well. And I think that weighs heavily on Texans' minds.
Right. All right. Next question, Vanessa, you are up first on this one. What do you think the long-term impact of SB 7 and HJR 7 will be if they're approved, right?
I was just sitting here worrying about, them not getting approved, but
we're optimistic on this podcast. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, the long-term impact is that we're finally investing dedicated dollars for water, as Jeremy said, in a similar way that we do for transportation, so that we have a sustainable source of funding. And I think it enables the board to leverage their funding in their other programs to make those dollars last longer, which I know they did with the last round of funding, that $1 billion. So it really allows the board to scale their financing, their financial assistance that they're providing to communities. So but I'd have to go down the list, right? So there's funding for flood infrastructure, which we need, right? There's a lot of unfunded projects that are in that state flood plan that hopefully we could fund. Carlos mentioned more of the underserved rural communities, through the inclusion of EDAP. That now there's an opportunity to get funding into the hands of those communities. Wastewater projects were added as eligible projects under the Texas Water Fund. So that opens a whole lot more doors, because I know when it comes to wastewater projects, there really hasn't been a lot of funding allocated to that. So, of course, we've talked a lot about the water supply projects, and so obviously that's going to continue to be a need. I mentioned the ag conservation program, Only Growing. So, I think this amount of funding and the longevity of it really does open a lot of doors to the needs that we have in the state and to actually fund them. I'd be curious to know from Jeremy though, when is enough? What's the magic number?
Well, I think 20 billion, or Carlos said 22.5 billion is like a great start, and it is historic, it's significant, it's meaningful. It probably pales in comparison to the long-term funding needs that we have.
Right.
But first of all, there's no other state that's proposing to do what Texas is doing, and it will still make a meaningful step forward towards addressing our long-term water infrastructure challenges. One thing I wanted to say was, I think if voters approve Proposition 4 in November, it shows to the market and to businesses looking to locate elsewhere, or the economic development community, it's sending a very bright, clear signal that the state of Texas is investing in the long game here to make sure we have the infrastructure we need for economic growth and activity and population growth. So the signal that could be sent this November will certainly be seen loud and clear, across the United States if voters say yes to Prop 4.
I have a follow-up for you, Carlos.
Sure.
So since you and I are the only old salts at the table, can I say that?
You can say that.
These two youngins
Yeah.
with us. What I wonder is this. I kind of look at, Texas, like most states, in the water world, we compare ourselves to California, for example, a lot. Kind of the period in which Texas was getting a lot of federal money for water projects and building reservoirs, that all kind of came to an end in the 1980s, but it never was really replaced with anything. And I always feel like, now we've gone from, when we were, super focused on getting federal money, and we had built up a surface water supply, right, by all those new reservoirs, and then we stopped building new reservoirs, and people started really moving into Texas, right, about that time, and now, the population of the state's really, proliferated, or, mushroomed or whatever, and we're coming back to kind of replacing the missing element of water funding, from it being mostly on the locals, shoulders, to the state is finally kind of really stepping in a meaningful way.
That's an interesting point. Federal money did not go away entirely.
Right.
But what happened with the federal money is it was devalued dollars. And what I mean by that is you can do more with a state dollar for a water project than you can with a federal dollar. The reason being, federal money, for whatever political reason one wants to attach to it, they add requirements that have nothing to do with the project, but they add cost to it.
Right.
And so it serves as a disincentive. Yes, I have federal money, but if I have to comply with all of the things that had nothing to do with my project, then I'd rather seek the funding elsewhere. The other aspect of it is, I think the state funding, like Texas is now pursuing, also invites, I think the message, I love the way Jeremy put it, the message you send to the market also opens up a potential funding source that we haven't maximized in Texas. There's a ton of private capital sitting out there waiting to invest in water. I think that this is what you were referencing, Jeremy.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that you know what that does? That adds leverage. As two people that served at the Water Development Board, we recognize that every private capital dollar that gets invested in the economic future in Texas adds flexibility and adds capacity to the state programs. I don't know if you want to add to that, Jeremy.
100% correct, Carlos. And I think your comment about the flexibility of state dollars compared to federal dollars. We have Davis-Bacon, Buy American requirements that all go hand in hand with federal spending requirements. What the state of Texas is doing with its own funding program here is radically new and different, and really opens the door, I think, for more aggressive water infrastructure development, hopefully in a positive way.
And I think it also allowed the state to say, you know what, we're not going to fund project elements that are going to be creating a negative impact, particularly in the area of origin, and particularly for rural Texans.
100%.
Yeah, I feel like actually so much of this whole water package is about protecting rural water supplies. I mean, by emphasizing new water supplies, that I think a lot of times larger cities will be the ones developing. It kind of helps to reduce the chances of cities going after rural communities' groundwater supplies. And then there's always been an emphasis, even in the 88th session about rural communities being able to access these dollars. So I think that's an important piece of that.
So Carlos, I'm going to go to you on this next one. We're going to be optimists, right? And we're going to assume that the voters are going to approve the new funding in November. If they do you think the legislature's done with water finance for a while, or is it now something that is going to be appearing on the agenda, every session somewhere?
I think, we have standing committees that deal with water all the time, and so water will never leave the legislative session. We always will continue to have water pressures. Is there going to be pressure to fund it in a sustainable manner as the historic actions that they took this session? Probably not, but I do see it coming back in the near future. Jeremy pointed out the what-ifs that actually may not result in the intended full investment that we're looking for. And so I think water will continue to be an issue. I think what you're seeing during the interim, and I hope we talk about that here as well, is we have funded now water. We need to be funding the science behind the decisions.
You just stole the words out of my mouth.
Yeah, we do. We need to be, look.
It's the management and science.
And you have to be making sound decisions. Here's the bottom line. If we make money available for projects, we haven't solved anything. If we make money available for projects and we choose projects with questionable models and questionable science, we really have not solved portions of it. If we continue to make money available and we don't address the modeling deficiencies that we have and the questionable science that we need to develop more robustly, and at the same time address getting access to those funds, particularly by small and underserved communities, we haven't solved it all. All those elements are always going to be out there needing to be talked about. I think the point we were making, where we ended up at the end of the session, particularly with a focus on groundwater, I think that's the next big thing, and that's Vanessa's big, topic.
Take it away, Vanessa. You topic.
Well, Carlos is totally right. I think there needs to be a shift in really looking at the management and the science that informs that management moving forward, and particularly with respect to groundwater, because we just lack so much of that. And Jeremy mentioned the big hearing last week. That was last week.
Yeah, I listened to it. It took me 2 days.
Yeah, I was there the whole time.
You spoke at the
end.
I did. I spoke
Yeah,
at the very end.
Midnight.
At midnight. Yeah, that was a first for me.
You did great.
Thank you. But yeah, of course, this is about a proposed large groundwater production. May or may not be an export project, although I think that's what most people are surmising. That would, pump a phenomenal amount of water from this region. And of course, locals are really concerned about their water supplies. and they're struggling to figure out what to do. The groundwater district's trying to figure out like what can they do. And so I think it just really highlights what we are seeing on a larger statewide basis, which, you know, we've been Carlos and I and others, Jeremy, like we've been talking about for several sessions, which is, you know, how we can equip groundwater districts with the information that they need to actually make good decisions. And then, I mean, from my perspective, we also need to be looking at how the state is providing them with clear authority to know what to do. And so I think that's where, you know, Chapter 36 is a good framework. Chapter 36 is the section of the water code that gives groundwater conservation districts their authority. And it is a good framework, but it really is more of like, here, groundwater districts, you can do this if you want.
Right.
But it doesn't actually say you must do this.
Right.
You know, and that sort of hands-off approach has, I think, worked in Texas for a while because, you know, we're a big state and, you know, have large ranches and you can kind of do what you want on your property and it doesn't necessarily impact your neighbor. But I think as we've seen like increased land fragmentation and we see increased population growth, we don't really live in a state anymore where you can do whatever you want. It's like what you do might affect your neighbor beyond the fence line. And so that's where I think that regulation can actually work to protect property rights. Whereas in the past, I think we've been reluctant to create a framework that is, you know,
Right.
I think that provides districts with more teeth because of how it might impact property rights.
Right. Well, you know, this whole discussion about the rural capture, and you know, I think there was a long time sentiment that was protecting their property rights in many ways, but no, it's not doing that, and it's a tort law, and you know, if you live near somebody who's got a big well field, and you know they're extracting groundwater and selling to somebody else, you know that that's not protecting your private property rights in any way.
Yeah, I mean, and there was obviously discussion about the rule of capture at this hearing, which was very interesting because, you know, I don't think no one ever wants to talk about it. Let me just say like two things about the rule of capture. One, kind of just what you were saying, it is a legal doctrine. It's not a property right. And it, I think, does the opposite of protecting the right
Absolutely.
that you have in groundwater because you can't sue someone to protect it. So, but that being said, you know, even if the rule of capture went away, like it doesn't solve the problem of like how we actually are going to ensure that we have sustainable long-term sources of groundwater for communities in the future. Like we do that through management, we do that through groundwater conservation districts. And so, you know, I feel like it's important to just say that because I think people think, oh yeah, we get rid of the rule of capture. That's like you know, let's wave that magic wand and all of our problems are going to be solved.
It makes it worse.
It might make it worse, but it just doesn't, it's not really the issue. The issue is about management and equipping and empowering GCDs to be able to do their jobs effectively.
So, you know, there's often in discussions about groundwater, you know, people will say, you know, the Edwards Aquifer Authority is kind of the model, right? That's a standard we're working for. Well, you know, rule of capture still applies to the Edwards Aquifer.
Right, yeah.
Right.
You still can't sue your neighbor.
Right. Still can't sue them. I mean, you've got a permit for how much you can use, and that permit can be restricted based on, you know, the level of the aquifer and, you know, other factors. But, yeah, it still applies there. So.
Well, and because, you know, if there's a groundwater district that's doing a good job managing, you don't need to sue your neighbor.
Right.
Right? That's the whole point.
Right.
So.
All right, so Senate Bill 7 and HJR 7 were not the only water bills that became law or will become law on September 1st. I want to give each of you a chance to mention a couple of bills that you think are significant and why you think they're significant. And Vanessa, we're going to start with you.
Okay. Well, I'm actually not going to talk about a bill. I'm going to talk about additional funding that was appropriated that I think is extremely significant. And it actually did start with a bill, but this is the funding that the legislature appropriated to support local groundwater data and science needs. So originally we had, along with a large coalition, advocated for passage of House Bill 1400 that Cody Harris filed, and Senator Colforce was the Senate sponsor of that bill. And it created a program at the board that provided grants to groundwater districts to, conduct local data and science to make better decisions, as we just talked about. And it passed the House very quickly. It was the priority bill for Chairman Harris. And then as we sort of got into the nitty-gritty of discussions on Senate Bill 7 and House Joint Resolution 7, it kind of got caught up in all of that, and it didn't look like it was going to move on the Senate side. And so luckily, because the funding for this was a big priority for Chairman Harris and Senator Colforce, they pivoted and were able to get a rider in Article 9 put into the budget that essentially allocates money for the same reasons. It's funding for groundwater districts to do their local science needs. So this is the first time we've ever had funding like this in the state. Obviously the board will will work with districts to do projects, but it's the first time we've actually had the state be able to provide grant funding to districts to work on this type of these needs on their own. So that's a really big deal. And I don't want that to, I don't feel like we can emphasize that enough. And so moving forward, we're going to be having a lot of conversations with the board about kind of how they're going to get this money out the door, because it's actually more money than in a shorter period of time. I mean, the 1400 was asking for 15 million over a 10-year period. This is 7.5 over a 2. So, but I think there's a real need there, and when we worked with the Texas Alliance of Groundwater Districts to survey their members, and they identified up to 40 million in short term, 2 to 3 year needs that they have. So I don't think it's going to be a problem getting that money out the door, and I'm excited to see the kinds of projects that get funded with it. So that would be my biggest win, I would say.
Jeremy, you want to go next?
I want to hear what Carlos has to say about regional solutions.
That's exactly where I was going to go. So I referenced earlier the blueprint that Texas 2036 put together here 3.5 years ago. One of the things that we have learned is that it is better for state funding to maximize economies of scale and bring greater benefit to multiple communities than try to fund each one individually. But there are disincentives towards regionalization. And during the 88th legislative session, we were able to address some of those disincentives. We carried that forward in the 89th through great work. We passed, for example, Texas legislature passed Senate Bill 1169. It models a very effective program that has been in place in Florida for over 25, 28 years. It allows regional public entities to collaborate without giving up any level of control that they do not wish to give up. So you get rid of those disincentives. When you do that, you bring economies of scale, and your dollars, your state dollars, go a lot further. We also clarified during this session, the legislature did, the provision that was enacted during the 88th, that if you're a utility that has the ability to help somebody else, that it has regulatory compliance issues, that baggage of the lack of compliance history will not attach to the entity that's trying to do the right thing. So we did what is known as a safe harbor bill. We added some clarifications to that as well. We also added...
Let me just add something there. When I was working for the Public Blanket River Authority, we were asked to come in and take over a system that was failing, and we did, and then immediately got fined.
Exactly.
Like, you were like, what? You just asked us to come bail these folks out.
Was Carlos the commissioner when you got fined?
He might have been. No, I don't think so.
It could have been. A couple of others that I'll mention is because it relates to an area where I grew up and I have a lot of attachment to. We did have Senate Concurrent Resolution 13, which continues to bring attention to the need for Mexico to continue to finally address, actually, because the only thing they're continuing to do is to violate the 1944 treaty. It's time that they actually honor their obligation there. And when it comes to groundwater, there are provisions, again, critical steps in adding transparency and requirements to the establishment of desired future conditions, modifications and transparency in the management plans, and the ability for entities to collaborate in developing better science, and I applaud all of that.
Yeah, Carlos, I think we stood shoulder to shoulder when it came to arguing for the need to improve opportunities for regional solutions in Texas. I mean, there's so many reasons about why we need to focus on regionalization and regional solutions. And truth be told, I mean, the trend is actually working against regionalization. Even though the legislature has said over and over again, the most efficient way to develop water infrastructure is through regional solutions, we're seeing greater balkanization in the long run. But I want to talk about House Bill 16 that was ultimately became Senate Bill 7. This was the House version of Senate Bill 7. There's a couple provisions in there that were in the introduced version that first would have required that the state begin to assess drinking water and wastewater utilities to identify those that are failing, who are at risk of failing, using certain criteria. And what I really liked about that language was that it was a data-driven approach to first identify failing drinking water and wastewater utilities, or at-risk ones. And then it would have, once an utility was identified as failing, it would have triggered these other things that utility would have been eligible for, such as the receipt of technical assistance and also prioritization of financial assistance from the state. I think the idea here was to use the data to begin describing our utilities and use that data to triage our limited financial resources. And this is a model that's being used efficiently and at not a great cost by other states, including California, Louisiana, and I believe also Kentucky. And so I think we need to have a bigger conversation about using data to assess utilities, to identify failing ones, and triage their financial assistance.
Jeremy, like what happens now? How is it just through the prioritization in the funding programs themselves that the board is sort of identifying where the needs are, or how does the board target that?
It's basically through the IUP, the intended use plan, which first of all, we know that not every failing or at-risk utility would apply to the SRF to receive financial assistance, so they might not be recognized within the IUP.
Right.
And the second thing is we know that the SRFs focus principally on bringing utilities into compliance with state and federal clean and drinking water standards. And so I think, the IUPs are one way of trying to, gauge the magnitude of need. But we know that there's working models in other states that are being used to better pinpoint and target utilities that need assistance and technical assistance and financial assistance. Yeah. One other provision in Senate Bill 7 that I really like is in Article 3 of the bill, where it introduces these performance measures that are going to be used over time to track state achievement and success with regard to tackling our water infrastructure challenges. And I really like this because we're setting up this dedicated funding stream, $20 billion over the coming decades. It's used to expand our water supplies and fix aging, deteriorating systems. These performance measures will begin to help us measure how much progress we're making towards fixing these problems. And I think it's important for the water community to recognize that, yes, there are some big challenges, big problems that you're working to address, but we need to start developing a narrative about how the state's funding effort and how taxpayer dollars are working to deliver solutions that they're asking for.
Because when the time comes to come back and ask for more money, I don't think it's enough to just show that the money was spent.
Yes.
Which is how we tend to, answer that question now. I think we need to actually show the impact that it's had.
Yeah.
The answer
we've been talking about,
the answer, we spent $13 billion. It's a good answer, but what does it mean?
Yeah.
And what we need to start saying is we built 300,000 acre feet of water supply. We fixed 85 failing systems, and helping make sure that 10,000 school kids were able to not miss school because they were drinking contaminated water. We need to start having these metrics, other than spending outlays, that describe success here.
Todd, you made a comment earlier about you and I being the salty dogs around here. There's another thing, and it goes to what Vanessa said. What next? Also, I'm sitting here thinking, and you hear all of us saying, "We did this and this occurred." There's something that significantly has changed over the last 4 years or so. It used to be that when we had generational type of actions being taken at the legislature, there was a lot of differing viewpoints, and there always will be, but there was contentious. I think with the water sector, and this is what I mean by we, it's so many more people than those of us that are at this table, the water sector has learned to speak with one voice and to say what it is that we're needing. We're needing investment. Water is critical. It's for our economic growth. So we're not utilizing water as a tool to beat development, but we also want it to be sustainable for future Texans. We've learned to speak with that one voice. Also, the legislature is the biggest part of the we. They have taken on the creation of a water caucus, and the Water Foundation assisted with that. That educates people as to the importance that water brings. That's a critical step. The we is a huge family that has learned to speak with one voice. And I know that you wanted to have some other folks around the table, and because of scheduling we couldn't be here. All those are very important voices to have heard from.
Yeah, whenever I use the word we, I don't mean PDF necessarily. I mean the collective we.
The collective we.
Yes.
I felt it.
Okay, so we're now going to move on. Now that we're joined by the jackhammer in the background, I think that's a jackhammer, something like that. But it just adds to the ambiance. I mean, that's maybe it's water infrastructure. Maybe you never know. You never know. So we're in a special session that's focused in part on flood preparedness and response as a result of the July 4th floods. What do each of you expect to see the legislature do regarding flooding and other water issues that might be added to the call for the special session? I think, Jeremy, you're supposed to start this one, or somebody else wants to start?
No, I want to point something out. So we had Sine Die on June 2nd. And since Sine Die, the legislature has had nearly 24 hours worth of committee hearings on water infrastructure. Mm-hmm. They spent 11 hours on groundwater, and then just earlier this week, they spent another 12 hours on flood control and disaster response. So even though we've had this historic water session, they've already spent nearly a day's worth of hearing talking about water infrastructure related issues. So the issues are certainly top of mind and not going anywhere. With regard to this session, I think that the July 4th floods clearly had a significant impression on the legislature. I think everyone's horrified and terrified at what actually transpired in the Hill Country basins on the early morning of July 4th. I think a lot of the focus is going to be on making sure we have the data in order to assess what the flood risks are, and also how we can improve and enhance our emergency communications. I still think there's some bigger questions in the long run with regard to our flood planning. But I don't know if they're going to have the time to be able to take that up during the special session.
Yeah. I don't think so.
What do y'all think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jeremy. I think Jennifer Walker from National Wildlife Federation has also been, really involved on in the flood planning process. And I know that I've heard her say the board had several recommendations to the legislature to improve flood management and planning. Simple ones like we need to fund more, improvements to low water crossings so people don't get swept away. That wasn't a priority this session. So I think that moving into the 90th, like really looking at what those Water Development Board recommendations are, which came from all of the flood planning groups. And then there are more recommendations that the flood planning groups had that the board didn't prioritize, but that I think are still really good, like dealing with building codes and that sort of thing. And so I think we need to take a hard look at all of those. And then we have to look at, the role that natural infrastructure plays. And there's a lot of talk about like flood mitigation and the connection between water supply. In fact, I heard, during the hearing, Brian Mapp was asked by Senator Perry about, how the flood financing works for flood projects. And, a lot of times those just have to be grants because you can't earn a revenue stream back from a flood project like you would from a water supply project. So there is some discussion, when you can combine like a flood mitigation project with a water supply project, maybe that opens the doors for additional funding. But with natural infrastructure, which can serve a really important role in mitigating flood, it also serves an important role in, I think, augmenting aquifers, like alluvial aquifers, and helping to kind of shore up those local water supplies too. And so I just don't feel like we should overlook those solutions as well. And I know that natural infrastructure is a component of the flood planning process too.
California has a very robust program to do what you were just talking about. So what do you think, Carlos?
I very little for me to add. I think it was covered perfectly. Just one question for Vanessa. Aquifers infrastructure?
Yes, aquifers are infrastructure.
Right, and that, the other side of it, yes, we are all focused on the flooding, and all of us know personally someone that was impacted. Unfortunately, it's terrible. But it's like Jeremy said, we've had that discussion. There's also been tremendous amount of focus on groundwater and sustainability, and I think that opens the door to discuss the other critical pillar that we need to address, and that is funding for better modeling and funding for better science.
So this has already come up, but I'll see if anybody wants to say anything specifically about it. The Texas House Natural Resources Committee had a marathon interim hearing. I guess it was classified as an interim hearing on groundwater last week, and people at this table were part of it. And so who wants to start some discussion or share some thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think we kind of already have talked about it. I mean, I think I don't know if these groundwater issues will get added to the special session call or not. We'll probably know well after this podcast gets published.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but assuming they don't, or even if they do, and it's very narrowly focused issue, I think during the interim and then the 90th session, we need to have a really focused look at groundwater export and on, as Carlos mentioned, ensuring that our modeling that we have the data that districts need to be able to make those decisions. And so that's especially important when you're dealing with these large projects, like whether it's for export or not. Because I mean, there's also questions about water use in data centers and what that's going to do to groundwater districts, and so that's a conversation that I think we need to have during the interim. And then I'm hoping to see like some really good solutions. Another big thing that was talked about at the hearing was groundwater surface water interaction, which was amazing to me because I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about that other than me.
Other than us, that's true.
Yeah, other than you, like at a hearing. And a lot of questions like, well, how do we not know like what groundwater pumping is going to do to the river or springs in this area, and it's just because we don't have that information. This is not an area that the board has really focused on. They've been doing a lot of work on the Brazos River, for example, but not up here in East Texas, and so I think looking at how we can increase the amount of groundwater surface water interaction knowledge that the board has and that trickles down to groundwater districts is really important too. We had legislation that we worked on 2 sessions ago that Representative Casal carried that I'm hoping will make sense to bring forth again.
If you go if you go through the Wayback Machine, there was a lot of discussion about that about 8 years ago or so when we were looking at creating the Edwards Aquifer Recovery Implementation Program.
Mm-hmm.
And, the key there is very large springs that you can easily measure the discharge from to figure out the, contribution to surface water flow downstream. And so, like, you're saying, we have a lot of springs in a lot of places, but a lot of them are really small. And they're contributing something, but we don't really know, and we haven't been able to measure that, or we haven't had the money to measure that, and it's a real question that came up with some stakeholder work I did, having to do with groundwater just east of Austin. That the constituents, stakeholders were worried about that, but no one really could quantify it.
Yeah.
So,
and here's the problem. Couple of comments on this. You and I were around when the state of Texas recognized in 1985 that we had missed the boat in surface water protection of flows for the environment. And by the time we figured it out and we didn't address it till 2007, from 85 to 2007, it was already too late. And I applaud what we did with Senate Bill 3, but we really haven't solved that issue yet. We're coming to terms with that. With groundwater.
Yeah.
The focus right now is in East Texas and the large project. You can take that county name and that project and change it by any other name in Texas, and you are going to find the exact same concern in many areas of Texas.
Other states.
And in
I
other
hear that
states,
same debate in Arizona and other places.
everywhere. And so we need to really address it because we cannot afford to repeat the failure that we had as a state between 85 and 2007 in not being able to capture the ability to protect our groundwater sources. It's a critical time to do that and to recognize it that as much as you may be upset about that particular project in East Texas, Hays County has a concern over groundwater. The Pecos County has a concern over groundwater. I mean, we can go down the list. San Saba has a concern about groundwater, surface water interaction. You mentioned we don't know the ability to have quantified the springs that contribute to surface flow. It's worse than that. Between the time that you did that critical work in the Edwards Aquifer Authority and now, we have springs that may have been flowing then that don't flow today. So now you can't even measure them. I'll get off my soapbox.
Jeremy, you got any more about that hearing before we go to our last question?
I'm just going to say it was perhaps one of the most amazing groundwater hearings I've ever heard, insofar as in the short order of 15 or 20 years, the legislature is beginning to recognize that there's limits to the rule of capture. And I think they're also recognizing that if you really want to enjoy the private property right in groundwater, there needs to be some regulatory framework in order to make sure that people that have that right can actually claim it in the long run.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, Jeremy, y'all have done a lot of work on the water markets, and I mean, we've talked about like groundwater markets, which other than in the Edwards, I feel like all we have really is groundwater marketing. It's just not really the same thing as a market. And one of the things I said in my testimony was that I felt like it's time for the legislature to explore giving groundwater districts the ability to actually cap production, similar to what has occurred in the Edwards, because I really don't see any other way that they can manage this privately owned yet shared resource and make sure that everybody has access in the long term to their fair share and honor the rights of those who want to conserve their groundwater in place. And so, I just don't see any other way. And other states have these really cool, like, groundwater retirement programs where landowners are getting paid to not pump, and we can't do that here. We're missing out.
I think, Texas 2036 will release a first in its kind historic report on water markets in Texas.
You heard it here, folks.
That was written by Todd Bottler here. We look forward to releasing that.
I got some help from Matt Berg and Gabe Collins.
And I think, markets are very different from water marketing, which is, in water marketing is often what's involved with these export permits that horrify everyone and lead to pretty bloody hearings. But I think we need to have a bigger conversation in the long run about what markets can do and what they mean for long-term sustainable water use.
All right. We are at the last question of what is my record longest podcast episode.
Oh, is it really?
I think so.
Oh, my.
It's close.
We could go for hours.
Well,
Anyone's still listening.
well, the funny thing is, the long ones get downloaded just as much as the short ones. I think it's the subject. So, for each of you, and Vanessa, you can start. How can our listeners find out more about your work? That's the easiest one. You don't need to think about it.
Yeah, no, I know. Well, because I think going to obviously EDF's website, we've got links to different things I've written and our blogs. But I also tend to post a lot on my own Instagram. If you want, my family life mixed in with groundwater information, that's your place to go. My handle's Groundwater Girl, which I'm real proud that I was able to secure. But we also have a newsletter EDF does called On the Waterfront, which highlights not only the work in Texas, but also the work that the rest of my colleagues are doing across the West, which is actually a great place for me often to lean in on and learn too, because as we've talked about today, other states are doing some cool things with water management that we can look to for solutions.
Jeremy, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. You can always find more about what we're doing on water and extreme weather at texas2036.org. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can download the reports that we've released, including the Water Infrastructure Blueprint that Carlos mentioned, as well as the 2 reports that were released late last year to help set the stage for this legislative session. But I'd also like to invite your listeners to reach out. They want to talk to me about water. But one of the questions that I'm asking a lot going into this legislative interim is, what do we think about state and regional water planning, and what are the opportunities? We're well past 25 years since this process started. It's delivered some fantastic results, but is it working the right way? And so if anyone's listening and want to talk about that, let me know.
Carlos.
Like Jeremy and Vanessa, we also have a website people can go to. It's www.rsah2.com. And in there you will also find publications that we've been involved in. And I would ask you listeners, you have a lot of publications. You were involved with the Texas Water Journal as well. Jeremy mentioned the reports that Texas 2036 has done. Vanessa has mentioned the publications that EDF has. That is a great way to find out what our position, what is the kind of work that we're doing. And you will also identify other partners that you may want to go learn from, the Texas Water Foundation, Texas Water Trade, Living Waters, the work that Perry Fowler does. I think you're going to find a lot of commonality from different viewpoints. And so any of those are excellent sources.
Great. Well, I want to thank all 3 of you for, finding a time to meet today. It was kind of a struggle, I know. I mean, y'all are super busy people. And so I do really appreciate you carving out this time in your schedule. So Vanessa, Jeremy, and Carlos, thank you. And just say that this has been Talk Plus Water, and my guests today were Vanessa Puig-Williams, the Senior Director of Climate Resilient Water Systems at the Environmental Defense Fund, Jeremy Mazur, the Director of Infrastructure and Natural Resources Policy for Texas 2036, and Carlos Rubinstein, the Principal of RSAH2O LLC. I want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast. Finally, I want to give a big thank you to Anna Huff at the Meadow Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting each episode of Talk Plus Water ready to flow. I dropped that for a while, but I just put it back in. If you enjoyed our discussion today, please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review to let us know how we did. And if you want to take it to another level, you can support Talk Plus Water through our account on Patreon. And if you did support us through our account on Patreon, you would be the first person to do so, because no one's done yet. My name is Todd Butler. Let's talk water again soon.